What about the sort of Russian US dynamics in terms of negotiations? Most people think of them as the peace deal initiations, but they're not. They're bilateral restoration of ties more than anything else. And the peace sort of negotiations in Ukraine is one component of the broader geopolitical grand strategic relationship that Trump and Putin are sort of re-establishing. What's your assessment there?
Russia's relationship with the United States is now a relationship where Ukraine is one issue among others. And I think that's the kind of revolutionary reset we have been seeing in the few meetings that they have had. It doesn't have any substance to it yet, but it's quite an important conceptual realignment. The Russians are extremely skeptical still about Trump because they feel very burned by Trump's first term when he engaged in policies that they found hawkish against them.
This is The Global Gambit.
How are you going, everybody? As we record, Zelensky and Trump seem to be... Well, Trump's accused Zelensky of potentially sort of starting World War III. We are recording as Zelensky and Trump are meeting in the White House after a very busy week for the US president in diplomatic terms, hosting Macron at the beginning of the week, and then Zelensky at the end or near the end. And it's been all sort of leading up to the, Ukrainian President Zelensky meeting Trump after obviously US and Russian negotiations, quote unquote, have started. Restoration of ties, perhaps, is more accurate. And there's a lot to talk about, simply. And someone who I think is, really well placed to do that is someone we've had on before, and sadly not more often because of certain things he has to manage. But it's Vlad Vexler, who is, someone who's been very supportive of the show. And I had one of the more philosophical, deep-seated conversations with a few months ago. And I'm delighted to have him back to talk about everything under the sun, from Russia to Europe to America to NATO. And Vlad, how are you? And what do you think of everything going on right now?
I'm happy to be with you. It's lovely to see your face. It's lovely to have everybody watching with us. Things are going really badly if we compare how they are going to the recent past. Right. But if we look at human history more widely, I think we don't necessarily need to freak out. But that's really hard because our recent history indicates that many of the things happening right now are not normal. And I'm very conscious of how it's just impacting people. I mean, it's even impacting people emotionally who are not normally, profoundly engaged with the global politics. So we're in a transitional period. And what's scary about that isn't just that it's a sense that things aren't going well. It's a sense that things aren't making sense because it is a period of transformation and people are not sure where things are going to land. So I'm sensing a lot of not just anxiety out there, but a lot of sort of perplexity about how to even make sense of what's going on.
Well, when you say out there, I mean, who are you referring to?
Well, I'm primarily referring to the transformation in global politics as a result of Trump's first few weeks in office, really.
Right. Okay. So out there meaning the world. So, I mean, if we want to start small and maybe expand outwards, but, obviously people who are most affected by this are people on the front lines in Ukraine. And, how do you think, because you engage a lot with people from various facets of life, how do you think people of the Ukrainian are managing it? Because there's some people want the war to come to an end, but people don't want to make concessions. So there's, how do we square that circle?
Well, I should be very conservative about talking about how Ukrainians feel. I haven't been to Ukraine since the beginning of the war. Indeed, I haven't traveled anywhere for health reasons since the beginning of the war. But I think what's happened is that the United States has shifted from a position under the Biden administration, which said, we support Ukraine's survival unconditionally, but not Ukraine's victory, to a position that says we support Ukraine's survival if that's convenient for us, and if it's not, we don't. So it's a position of enormous precarity, because it's not just that the powers backing you are suddenly changing their tune, it's that the whole arrangement of international affairs on which you were leaning for perpetuation of support and some kind of strategic clarity is up in the air. And you look to the United States if you are Ukrainian and you're very uncertain about what's going to come your way, and you look to Europe and you just see Europe looking to the United States with uncertainty about what to do and what to be. So it's a disconcerting situation, and it's made even worse by the fact that it's an incredibly painful conversation inside Ukraine what a victory or a good outcome means. Because there is this old story of what victory was, which has sort of been refuted by history. That's the story of territorial liberation leading to regime change in Moscow. That has been put aside, but it's now very difficult to put together another picture that really makes sense. And the problem is that for a picture to make sense, it requires a internal dialogue and conversation inside the country, but the country is at war, and having profound internal dialogue and having something like an election is both a blessing and a great threat. So it's a really difficult situation. If there is a single thing you're hoping for, if you're Ukrainian, it's some form of security guarantees, so that Ukraine isn't just told that it's going to get some weapons and some other modes of support. So that Ukraine is told there's going to be some kind of tangible security guarantee. It's not going to be NATO driven. It's not going to be US driven, but it's going to have a certain kind of bite that previous security guarantees Ukraine didn't have. That's the hope you have. But quite frankly, we're trending probably more against that being the destination where we land than toward it. But everything is enormously uncertain, and we're just at the beginning of a process in which all the key actors have no idea how it's going to end.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot here to dissect. Obviously, we're in a completely different international order, or in the transition towards that. I don't think there's really any qualms about the fact that the United States is still the most powerful, comprehensive power, but it doesn't have the same desire to exercise it or exert it in the same way, which is emboldening, obviously, middle powers and other sort of rogue or reckless nations as the West views them or coins them. But when it comes to Ukraine, let's get a bit more specific then, because I've had quite a few conversations with people, and one I had very recently about what security guarantees in Ukraine would look like. It's quite nebulous, right, Vlad? Because if the United States isn't going to be the overarching force behind the backstop, as Keir Starmer likes to call it, how does that work, right? Are the British going to send 2,500 troops, and that's going to be sufficient? I don't think so. So, does this involve NATO without the United States? What kind of capacity does that have? But more specifically than that, if the British are developing these sorts of bilateral or trilateral security assessments with the Ukrainians and Polish, as they did in late 2022, is that all we're going to see? We're going to see loads of these individual agreements combined, and sort of the British are there in their own way and the French are there in their own way. It's a multinational set of forces, but they're not necessarily that intertwined, which then kind of makes the point, well, why not just NATO? And also, why aren't countries even willing to commit them, right? The Polish and French have said that they're not willing to put troops in Ukraine. That seems rather confusing, considering Poland is upping their budget to nearly 5% for defense. So take me through all these themes.
Well, I think that the closest you could get to persuading the US of something that looks like a backstop, of providing the sorts of things it would need to provide for a European force to even logistically make sense in Ukraine, would be if the Europeans show inordinate enthusiasm and capacity for collective action that they're not showing so far. There is a divide in Europe between countries who feel that what's happening with Putin's brutal invasion of Ukraine is existential, and those that don't feel that way. And quite frankly, the position of most Western powers is that avoiding a direct confrontation between European and Russian forces, avoiding that risk, is a more important goal than Ukraine's survival. I think that's very roughly the position of Western Europe. That's very, very difficult. But at the same time, there is the realization that it would be good if we could do it. But as soon as these kind of statements come out from the mouth of Keir Starmer, for example, the UK Prime Minister, that he's sort of conditionally happy to commit UK troops if there is a nebulous US backstop, then you have to ask questions about the domestic stability of the governments that are raising these issues, and where are they going to be a year or two from now? So that's another issue. The fact that Europe is worrying about what's happened in the United States, but may itself only be an election cycle away from the same kind of people as Trump being in power in a few major European countries, possibly 2 election cycles away. So these are incredibly difficult issues. I am not able to sit here and rule out meaningful security guarantees, but what I would say is that that's not the direction toward which we are trending. We're trending in the direction of Ukraine hoping that it simply gets enough support of various kinds, including militarily, to pose a significant threat to Russia and thereby avert a reinvasion or a continuation of the war in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a lot of unwillingness, I think, by some people who are heavily pro-Ukraine to admit the likelihood that the Europeans would fully come to the support of Ukraine to ensure that it wins back everything is not there, right? This whole notion of Ukraine being in NATO is something that has been raised and repeated multiple times, but never been clarified in terms of an actual action plan, an actual map, right? You have a membership action plan, which is only something you get when you're even in the early stages of being part of NATO. You know, you're a candidate, which Ukraine has been fast tracked, but they're still in the early phases of sort of that candidacy. So does this not illustrate to you that really there is no follow through in terms of genuine commitment to that, and that it's more just sort of to give Ukraine more motivation and belief so that they continue fighting for themselves?
I think it's my view that if you are to generalize across the West, and there's a cacophony of different conflicting voices.
Yeah, of course, it's not a monolith.
Then you'd have to say that it's not the West's position that Ukraine can be in NATO, ever, roughly speaking. So that's one point. But a second point is that we have seen a profound degree of damage that NATO has accrued in the last few weeks, damage to its legitimacy and genuine doubts about the sustainability of Article 5, which I think has lost half of its efficacy just in the last few weeks alone. So there is another question about whether being in NATO would even guarantee Ukraine's security, and it might well not. So we are in the middle of a very major historical transformation. And I think a lot of the political actors that we're pointing to now in Europe, with the hope that they get their act together, are themselves in a difficult position, discombobulated, and somewhat lost in the face of what's happening, and engaging in a series of sort of proactive steps that are more proactive than they're necessarily efficacious. There's a sense of disorientation, even when Europeans are meeting and trying to figure out what the next steps might be. So it's a situation of great flux. Then on the Russian side, Putin's position, even though he does realize that NATO is now weaker than it used to be, Putin's position is that Ukraine cannot ever be in NATO, and that still remains existential for Putin. So Putin simply wouldn't agree to that unless something black swan-like occurred in the next few weeks. I mean, it would just be an act of such self-destructiveness on Putin's own terms that he would need to be in a much weaker position in the war to accept Ukraine's NATO membership, even if it's just for the majority of the country that's still, still not under Russian occupation. So that's difficult, and I think that we're not seriously looking at the prospect of Ukraine being in NATO. We're talking about what level of buffer is Ukraine going to have to not leave it undefended from whatever it is that the Kremlin might come up with in the next 5+ years.
Yeah, but then, okay, if not NATO, then what of the EU, right? The European Union has been touted as something that Moscow was more willing to consider in previous years. I'm not going to go into the argument of neutrality because I think there's a lot of disingenuous points made about that by pro-Kremlinites. But more specifically, that, if Ukraine is part of the EU in some form, it's got access to the stabilization action plan, which is something that the EU has developed with Bosnia and other countries to help them stabilize before they begin to join, the customs union and things like that. But also, I think it's Article 47.2 of the Lisbon Treaty, which talks about security assurances of some form. So could you see Ukraine having options in the EU because it's a more comprehensive supranational body than simply a security alliance like NATO?
I'd be more inclined to be confident about Ukraine getting some guarantees from a coalition of the willing, rather than from the accession to the European Union. What I would say about Ukraine's steps westwards generally is that there could be a paradox here whereby the weaker Putin thinks the West is, the less rigid he may be about making some concessions in that direction. Because what's still true is that his goals in Ukraine are unchanged. He's still after political control over the whole country, and his key aim is ungovernability, which is why we should be very pessimistic about where negotiations can lead, because that's pretty firm a position of Putin's. But there's then a second destructive aspiration that Putin has had that in Ukraine that may have weakened now a little bit, and that's to use Ukraine as a kind of prong to destabilize the West, dissolve NATO and so on. And if we are dissolving by ourselves, then Putin would see the use of Ukraine as a prong to encourage us to dissolve as being less essential. So I see Putin weakening on that aspiration, but I still see him as being strongly committed to the idea that Ukraine must be ungovernable. And so the kind of deal he'd want to commit to, if he's going to be open to committing to any deal, is the kind of deal that he's going to think will leave Ukraine more politically precarious than not making any deal. That's roughly the equation that Putin is looking at. If he thinks that Ukraine is being put in a position in the course of a deal where it's got a set of promises that are not fully realizable and a set of aspirations and so on, that's going to leave Ukraine even weaker than it would be if Putin just carried on the war, he'd be more inclined to take that deal. If he doesn't see a deal as being more toxic for Ukraine than just carrying on the war, he is going to be disinclined to take that deal because he knows he can't sustain the war indefinitely. But he is persuaded. Now, there's two questions here. Is this actually true? And is this what he thinks? I'm just saying this is what he thinks. I think there's a good degree of evidence that it's at least partly true. He thinks that Ukraine is losing the war faster than Russia, as Mark Galeotti puts it, and both sides are losing, Ukraine's losing faster. So he is entirely open at the moment, it seems to me, about both the scenario of taking a deal and the scenario of perpetuating the war, and he will be choosing the option, whatever is on the table for him, that he thinks is most toxic for Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty self-explanatory that no war is beneficial, right? It's everybody loses in a war unless it's done within sort of 20 minutes. But again, there's still sort of let's be more specific in terms of what's happening in real time. We had the Macron hosting of European leaders in Paris beginning of last week. So is that who you think could be a coalition of the willing? Like, who specifically and in what capacity? Because I think Europe has the capacity; it just lacks coordination. Right? There's a poor united approach to taking ownership of this issue and being clear with Ukraine in terms of expectations, timeline, end point. Obviously, that's all on the European side. You've described Putin and such. So I don't know. I want to just break that down.
It's risky. It's risky for me to talk about it because I think it partly requires military expertise, which I don't have. So I think the right answer is I don't know what form that could take. Right? Asking somebody like Jack Watling would be appropriate. I'm not sure I am the right person to enlighten us about what's hypothetically possible, I'm afraid. I think partly because it would require a little bit of understanding of military matters, a little bit of understanding of the kind of dependence that we have on the United States at the level of air support, at the level of radar, at the level of intelligence. And I can't judge how dependent we are, quite simply because I'm an amateur fool when it comes to these things. So
no, I appreciate that. I think it's well,
I've got to be conservative. Fool, what I can say is that I'm not sitting here on some kind of clear picture of agency of who has to do what and how and by what means to generate this result. I'm afraid.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I think it's you're certainly no fool or whatever you self-described as. It's more just, I think, because there are nuances there naturally, and I think that the Europeans need to particularly step up in terms of offensive capabilities, defensive capabilities. But when it comes to logistics, there are certain areas that maybe the Europeans could strike a deal with the Americans to continue to supply them with reconnaissance, radar, and the more sort of logistical side of that. And I think Trump would be quite open to that idea because America still gets something from it, but they don't have to be on the ground, directly at the front door with any confrontation with Russia. But just sort of pivoting away from that then, what about the sort of Russian US sort of dynamics in terms of negotiations? Most people think of them as the peace deal initiations, but they're not. They're bilateral restoration of ties more than anything else. And the peace sort of negotiations in Ukraine is one component of the broader geopolitical grand strategic relationship that Trump and Putin are sort of re-establishing. What's your assessment there?
I think what you've said is actually very important, and not enough analysts have emphasized it. And I think that's one of the key changes that's happened, that Russia's relationship with the United States is now a relationship where Ukraine is one issue among others. And I think that's the kind of revolutionary reset we have been seeing in the few meetings that they have had. It doesn't have any substance to it yet, but it's quite an important conceptual realignment, putting the Russians on course for a certain degree of reintegration with the United States that is in part not dependent entirely on what happens in Ukraine. So I think that's a really, really important point. The Russians are extremely skeptical still about Trump because they feel very burned by Trump's first term when he engaged in policies that they found hawkish against them. And so they are not getting too excited despite all of the comments and ideas that Trump's come up with so far. Their position is roughly that they would love it if the Trump administration persisted with a path toward global politics based on spheres of influence. And I think that that's what the Russians want. The question now is that where the Trump administration is heading? And I think that there's a considerable degree of risk that the answer to that is yes, that the Trump administration is going to revert out of series of established historical relationships with allies, renegotiate these relationships on a much more transactional basis, a position that I think, in my view, weakens the United States, whatever picture of the global order you take. But it might be that that's where we are heading. And if that's where we're heading, then one of the countries that does have a sphere of influence under such a conception would be Russia. And Ukraine would be partly in Russia's sphere of influence. That's the Russian hope. And certainly there's a risk at the moment that that is where the United States is trending. That's one thing that's changed. Another thing that's changed is just the sheer unpredictability, even if it's simply at the level of rhetoric, of the Trump administration. And that simply means that decades upon decades of the kind of reliability that the United States established in its military and political and economic involvement across the globe is now put into question. And you can extort allies once, but you can't do it repeatedly, because eventually they're going to have to start hedging and not leaving themselves dependent on the United States. So there's this profound upheaval of the Western alliance happening right now, and we don't know where it will land. The aspiration that the Russians have in terms of what happens in Europe is that they are allowed to move closer toward having control over Eastern Europe. In other words, I think that pre-war ultimatum that the Russians came up with in 2021 still remains their aspiration, and they expect gradually to receive the possibility to make steps in that direction. That might mean NATO in some capacity clearing out of Eastern Europe. It might mean just a clear perception of the weakening of Article 5 when we think about the Baltic states. So that's the Russian aspiration. And how much of this they're going to get, in their view, depends on what happens in Washington, because they largely see Europe as itself devoid of agency. I mean, they see Europe as a sort of a set of confused vassal states that don't have much agency relative to Washington.
I don't know if I would say they see them as vassal states. I think they see them as more like, I don't know, just complacent, right? Rather sort of fat catty, overindulgent in sort of themselves.
It's disturbing how far Putin thinks that. It's disturbing how far Putin thinks that Washington can call the shots in Germany in the way it absolutely can't. I mean, in my view, Putin himself has these sorts of views. Not everybody in Putin's inner circle necessarily has these views, but Putin has these views that ultimately the United States can tell the Europeans what to do, and that they're going to comply. That's not reflective of reality. I agree with you about that. But I do think that that's a kind of illusion which sort of further exaggerates European incapacity beyond what it actually is, that Putin is stuck with. And so one of the things that could surprise Putin is actually a degree of European action and European recalcitrance in the face of this. And he's gonna find that perplexing if that happens.
Well, for sure. I think obviously the main thing that the Europeans need to do is to step up. They need to take ownership. I'm fed up with European ineptitude and complacency to really do anything. The amount of focus that the continent has put on important services, but today at a neglection, or by neglecting things like defense and hard power, and that over-reliance on the United States for security assurances. Well, it's the same, arguably, as the over-reliance on Russia for cheap energy, or China for big markets. Any of the three big powers, quote unquote, the Europeans have been, overly dependent on, has led to this situation. And I think I'd be interested for your perspective on Vance's speech, obviously in Munich, which seems to be overdone by the fact that Donald Trump is fighting literally in a shouting match with Zelensky as we record this. That European nations and capitals were still shocked by what Vance had to say. Why were people shocked? I was not shocked at all. This is something that we've known would be coming since, a year ago when Trump was beginning to choose his VP, and we were beginning to learn what Vance was like as a person. Why are European capitals still shocked? Vlad, help me out.
I think there is an element of outrage there, and I think that there's an element of just offense at the stylistic way in which this was delivered, because what was so offensive about it to the audience there is that in a way Vance spoke past them, partly directing himself to a domestic US audience, as is very often the case with foreign policy pronouncements by members of the Trump team. So partly it was the style of disregard that came with the delivery there. And beyond that, I think that there's still an enormous tendency to think of Trump as an aberration, which means either that you have to sit him out, you don't have to react to him in a profound way strategically, or you hope that he will get sufficiently co-opted by the various political institutions in the United States, and that will de-radicalize him. So I think that there's a kind of reversion to normalization that we are seeing in elite circles of power in Europe. We are seeing it also in the charity sector. I mean, the way the charity sector was paralyzed by what the Trump administration did with USAID is stunning, because again, that is something that was conceivably predictable. But people with power, running important organizations, doing really important work, were really caught off guard and sort of discombobulated. So we have a sort of crisis of evasion of reality in our politics that I think the reaction to Vance's performance in Munich revealed to some degree. You're also seeing the same with the Democrats in the United States right now. I mean, I said something a little bit silly the other day, that the Democrats look to me like an orchestra in a world in which musical instruments haven't been invented. They really don't know what to do, what to say, how to frame themselves, and how to challenge what's happening. So I think that there's a lot of denial about the global transformation that we're pretty inevitably embarking on now. And that's a real problem, because the time to act is now, especially as we might be experiencing our own turn of Trumpism within an election cycle or two in many West European countries. So I think that's some of the outrage. But of course, there's a lot of legitimate outrage there. I mean, J.D. Vance came to a security conference and didn't mention Ukraine a single time, when the preponderant concern of everybody in the room was the big security crisis that Europe is facing. He didn't mention that at all. And the critiques he made of the censoriousness and compression of discourse in Western societies, I actually think has a validity to it, but it is outweighed by the arbitrariness and illegitimacy and censoriousness of a far worse kind of many aspects of the Trump administration, right? So it's also the rank hypocrisy of whatever legitimate criticism he may have had. But even that legitimate criticism wasn't on topic of the issue of security. And then over and above that, the room felt that they weren't being spoken to, that they were being given a speech that was essentially designed to boost a domestic US audience. So I think that's some of what was found so toxic about it. And to a mild degree, I think people were reassured by some of the things J.D. Vance said there more informally at the conference. But nevertheless, it was a shock. And
yeah, it was
an kind of an experience of something that felt like a counter-revolutionary rebellion against an order that was perfectly legitimate by some kind of vanguard that wasn't legitimate. So that's I think my take on what was
quite
so
a comprehensive
shocking about
and mixed. Era-defining, shall we say, Munich Security Conference. But everybody, that's quite a cliffhanger for part one. We'll see you in part two.